Sometimes the most intimate moment between two strangers isn't what you'd expect. It's when someone finally sees you for who you really are. David was having one of those nights where everything felt wrong. His laptop screen glowed in the dark apartment, showing a half-finished logo design that looked worse every time he stared at it. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he kept sipping it anyway, making faces at the bitter taste. Outside, the city was winding down. Cars moved slower on the street below. The building had gotten quiet except for the usual sounds. Pipes creaking, someone's TV through thin walls, footsteps in the hallway that always seemed to stop right above his head. He'd been living in this place for 3 years now. It wasn't much to look at. The kitchen was barely big enough for one person, and the bathroom door stuck every single time. But it was his space. Nobody bothered him here. Nobody expected anything from him. After his last relationship ended 6 months ago, this apartment had become his safe haven. The breakup with Jessica had been one of those slow, painful things that dragged on for months before either of them had the courage to end it. She said he was emotionally distant. He said she expected too much. They were probably both right. Now he spent most evenings like this one, working late, ordering takeout and pretending he was perfectly fine living alone. David stretched his arms above his head and heard his shoulders crack. The clock on his computer showed 10:15 p.m. He should probably call it a night, but the deadline for this project was tomorrow, and the client had already changed their mind about the color scheme twice. He took another sip of cold coffee and grimaced. That's when he heard it. The sound of his front door opening. At first, he thought he was imagining things. Sometimes the building settled in weird ways and sounds carried strangely through the old walls. But then he heard footsteps. Actual footsteps in his hallway. David's heart started beating faster. He lived alone. He always locked his door. The only people who had keys were his landlord and, "Hello?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then continued toward his living room. David saved his work quickly and turned around in his chair. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, but it definitely wasn't Elena from upstairs. She stood in his doorway looking nothing like the Elena he usually saw in the elevator or at the mailboxes. Usually she was put together. Business clothes, hair perfect, always rushing somewhere important. Tonight she looked different. Her hair was loose around her shoulders and she was wearing a simple dress that seemed too fancy for a Tuesday night at home. "Elena?" David stood up, confused.
How did you?
"Do you still have my spare key?" She nodded but didn't explain. David remembered now. He'd given it to her months ago when he went out of town for a week. She'd agreed to water his plants and collect his mail. He'd completely forgotten to ask for it back. "Is everything okay?" he asked. There was something in her expression he couldn't read. She looked calm on the surface, but her eyes seemed distant, like she was thinking about something far away. Elena stepped into his living room without being invited. She looked around at his messy coffee table, the empty takeout containers he hadn't thrown away, the pile of clean laundry on his couch that he kept meaning to fold. "I'm sorry for just walking in," she said, but she didn't sound sorry. Her voice was steady, almost too steady. "I needed to get out of my apartment." David noticed she didn't say my apartment. She said my apartment like it was a place she was trapped, not a place she lived. He'd seen her husband a few times. Tall guy, always on his phone, always seemed to be in a hurry. They never looked particularly happy together, but David had learned not to make assumptions about other people's relationships. "Do you want to sit down?" David offered, moving the laundry pile to make room on his couch. "I could make some tea or something." Elena shook her head. "I don't want tea." She walked over to his window and looked out at the street. David wasn't sure what to do with himself. He'd never been good in situations like this. When people were upset, he usually said the wrong thing or didn't say anything at all. Jessica used to tell him he was terrible at reading emotional cues. "Elena, are you sure you're okay? You seem..." He searched for the right word. "Different." She turned away from the window and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd arrived. There was something in her gaze that made David uncomfortable, not because she looked upset, but because she looked too calm, like she'd made some kind of decision. "Do you ever feel invisible, David?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean really invisible, like you could disappear tomorrow and nobody would notice for weeks." David thought about his own life. Work clients who only contacted him when they needed something. friends he hadn't talked to in months, family members who called on holidays and birthdays, but not much else. Sometimes, he admitted. I feel like that every day, Elena said. She moved closer to him, and David caught a scent of her perfume, something floral and expensive that didn't match the sadness in her voice. My husband comes home every night, eats dinner, watches TV, and goes to bed. We haven't had a real conversation in months. Sometimes I wonder if he'd even notice if I wasn't there. David didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been married, never lived with someone long enough to experience that kind of routine indifference, but he could imagine how lonely it must feel. Maybe you should talk to him about it, he suggested, immediately regretting how simple that sounded. Elena laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I've tried. He just says I'm being dramatic. She was standing very close to him now, close enough that David felt awkward. He took a small step back, but she followed. Elena, what's going on? Why are you really here? She looked at him for a long moment, and David saw something shift in her expression. The calm mask slipped just a little, and he glimpsed something desperate underneath. I needed to feel like someone could see me, she said quietly. Before David could ask what she meant, Elena reached behind her neck. David heard the soft sound of a zipper being pulled down. His mind went completely blank. David's brain stopped working for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. The zipper sound echoed in his mind as he watched Elena's dress slip from her shoulders. She stood there with that strange, calm smile on her face, like she'd just asked him about the weather, instead of doing something that turned his entire evening upside down. Elena, what are you doing? The words came out as barely a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Her smile never wavered, but David could see something desperate flickering behind her eyes. I'm trying to feel alive, she said finally. David's hands were shaking. He'd imagined scenarios like this before. What guy hadn't? But the reality was nothing like his imagination. This wasn't excitement or desire he was feeling. It was panic mixed with confusion and a deep sadness he couldn't explain. Elena, I don't think you really want this, he managed to say, looking everywhere except at her. His eyes landed on his coffee mug, his laptop, the pile of laundry, anything that felt normal and safe. How do you know what I want? She asked. There was an edge to her voice now, the first crack in her composed facade. David forced himself to look at her face, really look at her. What he saw there made his chest tight. She wasn't confident or seductive like she was trying to appear. She looked lost, broken even. Because you're crying, he said softly. Elena's hand flew to her cheek, surprised to find tears there. For a moment, her careful composure crumbled completely. She looked like a child who'd gotten caught doing something she knew was wrong. David moved quickly, grabbing the throw blanket from his couch and wrapping it around her shoulders. His movements were gentle but firm, like he was handling something precious and fragile. Please, he said, let me get you something to wear. Elena pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly seeming to realize what she'd done. The strange smile disappeared, replaced by embarrassment and confusion. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't know why I did that. David went to his bedroom and grabbed the first clean shirt he could find, a soft gray sweater that would be huge on her. When he came back, Elena was sitting on his couch, wrapped in the blanket, staring at her hands. Here, he said, setting the sweater beside her. I'll make that tea now. Take your time. He retreated to his kitchen, giving her privacy to get dressed. His hands were still shaking as he filled the kettle with water. He could hear Elena moving around in the living room, the soft sounds of fabric and quiet sniffles. What had just happened? In all his years of living, David had never encountered a situation like this. He'd had friends go through messy breakups, seen people make questionable decisions when they were hurting. But this felt different, more desperate. The kettle clicked off, and David poured hot water over 2 tea bags. He added honey to both cups, remembering that Elena had ordered honey in her coffee the few times he'd seen her at the cafe downstairs. When he returned to the living room, Elena was curled up in the corner of his couch, swimming in his oversized sweater. She'd pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The confident woman who'd walked into his apartment 20 minutes ago was completely gone. Thank you, she said when he handed her the mug. Her voice was small and hoarse. David sat on the opposite end of the couch, leaving plenty of space between them. They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea and listening to the sounds of the building settling around them. "My husband hasn't touched me in 6 months," Elena said suddenly. David nearly choked on his tea. "Elena, you don't have to—" "Not like that," she interrupted. "I mean, he hasn't touched me at all. No hugs, no casual kisses, nothing. We live in the same apartment, sleep in the same bed, and I might as well be invisible." She set down her mug and hugged her knees tighter. I started wondering if maybe there was something wrong with me. Maybe I wasn't attractive anymore or interesting, or worth noticing. David wanted to tell her that was ridiculous, that any man would be lucky to have her attention, but he sensed she needed to talk more than she needed reassurance. Tonight, we had dinner in complete silence again. He scrolled through his phone while I ate. When I tried to tell him about my day, he just nodded without looking up. Finally, I asked him if he was happy, and you know what he said? David shook his head. He said, "What kind of question is that?" Like I was being unreasonable for wanting to know if the person I married actually enjoyed being married to me. Elena's voice was getting stronger, but David could hear years of hurt behind her words. I went to our bedroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I put on this dress. It used to be his favorite, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time he really looked at me. Really saw me. She glanced at David, then looked away quickly. "I know what I did was wrong. I know it was unfair to you. I just needed someone to see me as more than furniture in their life." David set down his own mug and leaned forward slightly. "Elena, you're not invisible, and there's nothing wrong with you. Then why do I feel like I'm disappearing a little more every day?" The question hung in the air between them. David realized that this wasn't really about attraction or desire. It was about Elena drowning in her own life and grabbing for anything that might pull her back to the surface. "Maybe," David said carefully. "You're in the wrong place with the wrong person." Elena looked at him with surprise, like this possibility had never occurred to her. "But we're married," she said, as if that explained everything. "Being married doesn't mean you have to be miserable," David replied. "And it definitely doesn't mean you should feel invisible." For the first time since she'd arrived, Elena's smile looked real. The silence that followed felt different from the awkward quiet earlier. This time it wasn't uncomfortable. Elena stared into her tea like she was seeing something in the steam that David couldn't see. "I used to be different," she said finally. "Before I got married, I mean. I had opinions about things. I'd argue with people at work about projects I cared about. I'd stay up late reading books that made me think. I felt like myself." David settled back into the couch cushions, realizing this was going to be a long conversation. Part of him wanted to suggest she call someone else, a friend, a family member, maybe even her husband. But another part of him, the part that had been feeling pretty invisible himself lately, understood why she was here. "What changed?" he asked. Elena laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time. Just sad. Nothing dramatic. That's the weird part. It happened so slowly I didn't notice until one day I woke up and realized I'd become this person I didn't recognize. She tucked her feet under her, getting more comfortable. David's sweater hung loose on her frame, making her look younger somehow. "When we first got married, I thought I was being a good wife by trying to fit into his life. He liked quiet dinners, so I stopped suggesting we try new restaurants. He preferred staying home on weekends, so I stopped making plans with friends. He didn't like when I got too excited about things, so I learned to keep my emotions smaller." David found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested in what she was saying. It reminded him of his own relationship patterns, the way he'd slowly made himself smaller to avoid conflict. "Before I knew it, I was this quiet, agreeable person who never rocked the boat. And you know what the really messed up part is? He stopped paying attention to me anyway. It turns out that being the perfect, uncomplicated wife just made me boring." "You're not boring," David said automatically. Elena gave him a look that was half grateful, half skeptical. "How would you know? We've had maybe 10 conversations in 2 years, and most of those were about packages being delivered to the wrong apartment." She had a point. David realized he'd been seeing Elena through the same surface-level lens that her husband probably used. Pretty woman, seemed nice, lived upstairs. He'd never thought about what her life might actually be like. "Tell me something that would surprise me about you," he said. Elena blinked, caught off guard by the request. "What?" "Something your husband doesn't know. Something that would surprise me." She thought for a long moment, chewing on her bottom lip. "I write poetry." David waited for more, but she seemed to think that was enough. "What kind of poetry?" "Terrible poetry," she said with a small laugh. Really awful stuff about feelings and rain and how coffee shops make me nostalgic for things I never actually experienced. Can you remember any of it? Elena's cheeks turned pink. You don't want to hear my poetry. Trust me. Try me. She looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he was making fun of her. Whatever she saw in his face must have convinced her he was serious. Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you. She cleared her throat dramatically. There's this one I wrote last week. It goes, the barista knows my order but not my name, like everyone else who serves my life in small measured portions. I pay an exact change and leave no trace, a ghost who drinks too much caffeine. David was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd just heard. It wasn't terrible at all. It was actually kind of beautiful in a sad way. That's not awful, he said. That's honest. Elena looked surprised. Really? You're not just being nice? I'm not that nice, David said, which made her laugh for real this time. My husband would hate it. He thinks poetry is pretentious. He says people who write it are just trying to make simple things sound complicated. David felt a flash of anger toward this man he'd never met. What does he do for fun? Golf, fantasy football. He collects expensive whiskey that he never drinks because it's too good for regular occasions. Elena paused. I'm not trying to make him sound terrible. He's not a bad person. We're just different. Different can work, David said carefully, but only if both people respect the differences. Elena nodded slowly. I think I've been trying so hard to be what he wanted that I forgot how to be what I wanted. What do you want? The question seemed to catch her off guard again. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. I want someone to ask me questions like you're asking me. I want to have conversations that last hours because we lose track of time. I want to feel like my thoughts and feelings matter to someone. She paused, looking embarrassed. I want someone to read my terrible poetry and tell me it's not that terrible. David smiled. For what it's worth, I meant what I said. It really wasn't terrible. You probably just have low standards for poetry. Maybe. But I know something about feeling invisible, and your poem captured that perfectly. Elena studied his face. Do you feel invisible too? David nodded. Different reasons, but yeah. Since my last relationship ended, I've basically been living like a hermit. Work, Netflix, sleep, repeat. Sometimes I go whole days without talking to another person. Why did it end? Your relationship, I mean. David considered how much to share. He'd never been good at opening up to people, but something about the evening's strange intimacy made honesty feel safer than usual. She said I was emotionally unavailable. She was probably right. I have this habit of shutting down when things get intense. Instead of fighting or talking through problems, I just go quiet and hope they'll resolve themselves. Did they? Resolve themselves? No, David admitted. They just built up until she couldn't take it anymore. Elena was quiet for a moment. We're quite a pair, aren't we? You disappear when things get emotional, and I just became someone else entirely. Maybe that's why we're both sitting here at almost midnight, drinking tea and having the most honest conversation either of us has had in months. Elena looked around David's apartment, really looked at it this time. She noticed his design work scattered on the desk, the books stacked on every available surface, the camera equipment in the corner. You're a photographer too? She asked, nodding toward the camera. Hobby mostly. I like taking pictures of the city at weird hours when there aren't many people around. Can I see some? David felt that familiar flutter of anxiety he got whenever someone asked to see his personal work. But Elena's genuine curiosity made it feel less scary than usual. Sure, he said, getting up to grab his laptop. But only if you promise to show me more of your poetry sometime. Elena smiled, and for the first time all evening it reached her eyes. Deal. David opened his laptop and scrolled through folders of photos. His fingers hesitated over the mouse. These weren't just pictures to him. They were pieces of his soul that he'd never shown anyone. Even Jessica had only seen a few of his safer shots, the ones that didn't reveal too much about what he was thinking or feeling. I usually take these walks around 2 or 3 in the morning when I can't sleep, he said, clicking on a folder labeled Night Walks. The city looks different when it's empty. The first photo appeared on screen, a street corner under flickering streetlights, with shadows that looked like they were reaching for something just out of frame. Elena leaned closer to get a better look, and David caught that floral scent of her perfume again. This is beautiful, she said softly. It feels lonely, but in a good way. Like peaceful lonely, not sad lonely. David looked at her with surprise. Most people saw his night photography as depressing or weird. Elena had somehow understood exactly what he was trying to capture. That's exactly what I was going for, he said, scrolling to the next image. I like how empty places still have stories in them. They went through photo after photo. A bus stop with a single forgotten umbrella, an all-night diner with one customer reading a book, a park bench with fresh graffiti that said "We were here" in careful handwriting. You see things differently than most people, Elena said. These aren't just pictures. They're like moments that mattered to someone, even if we don't know who. David felt something warm spreading in his chest. It was the same feeling he got when he captured a perfect shot, but different. Better. Your turn, he said, closing the laptop. I showed you mine, Elena groaned. I don't have my notebook with me. And besides, memorizing your own poetry feels weird and self-important. Then tell me about when you write. What makes you pick up a pen? Elena tucked her legs under her again, thinking. Usually when I'm feeling something I can't say out loud. Like last month, I was at the grocery store and this old couple was shopping together. They weren't talking much, but every few minutes one of them would put something in the cart, and the other would nod or smile. They had this rhythm, you know? Like they'd been doing this dance for decades. David nodded, encouraging her to continue, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time my husband and I had that kind of connection, even over something as simple as choosing cereal. So when I got home, I wrote this poem about two people who shop in the same store but never see each other, even when they're in the same aisle. That sounds sad and beautiful at the same time. Most of my poems are like that lately. Sad and beautiful. Elena paused. I wonder what that says about me. Maybe it says you're paying attention to things that matter, David suggested. A lot of people go through life without noticing the important stuff. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Is that why you take pictures at night? Because you're paying attention? David considered this. I think I started doing it because I felt safer when no one else was around. But now I think it's more about finding beauty in spaces that other people ignore. Like what? Like how the light from a 24-hour laundromat makes the sidewalk look warm and welcoming even at 3 a.m. Or how graffiti on a subway wall can be poetry if you look at it right. Elena smiled. I think we're both collecting the same things, just in different ways. The conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing. He glanced at it and saw a text from his client asking about the logo design he'd been working on earlier. Sorry, he said, showing Elena the message. Work stuff. I should probably finish this tonight. Elena's face fell slightly. Oh, I should probably go home anyway. It's getting late and you have things to do. But she didn't move to get up. Instead, she stared at her hands, and David could see that familiar, distant look creeping back into her eyes. Elena, he said carefully, are you okay going home? I mean, are you and your husband? Do you feel safe there? Safe? She looked confused by the question. Oh, you mean physically? Yeah, he's not violent or anything. He's just... She searched for the right word. Absent. David nodded, but still felt unsettled. What if he's angry that you've been gone? Elena laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. He probably hasn't noticed. He was watching TV when I left, and he'll probably be watching TV when I get back. Same show, same spot on the couch. David saved his work and closed the laptop. What if you stayed here tonight? The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Elena. What? I mean on the couch, David said quickly. I just think, maybe you shouldn't have to go back to feeling invisible tonight. Maybe you could stay somewhere you feel seen. Elena stared at him. You barely know me. I walked into your apartment uninvited and did something completely inappropriate. Why would you want me to stay? David thought about this. Why did he want her to stay? It wasn't about attraction, although he'd be lying if he said she wasn't beautiful. It wasn't about loneliness either, although he had been feeling pretty isolated lately. Because I think you're interesting, he said finally, and I think you deserve to be around someone who thinks you're interesting. Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked different. Not desperate or sad, but something else. Grateful, maybe. Or hopeful. I can't ask you to do that, she said. You're not asking. I'm offering. Elena looked around the apartment again, then back at David. What about tomorrow? What happens in the morning, when we both have to go back to our real lives? David shrugged. I don't know. But tonight doesn't have to be about tomorrow. Tonight can just be about tonight. Elena was quiet for a long time. David could practically hear her thinking, weighing options he couldn't see. "I should at least text him," she said finally. "Let him know I won't be home." "Okay." Elena pulled out her phone and typed a quick message. David tried not to watch, but he couldn't help noticing that she didn't seem nervous about her husband's potential reaction. "Done," she said, putting her phone away. "I told him I'm staying with a friend tonight." "Are we friends?" David asked. Elena considered this seriously. "I don't know what we are, but I know I feel more like myself sitting on your couch in your too big sweater than I have in months." David smiled. "Then I guess we're something." David woke up before his alarm, which never happened. For a moment, he couldn't remember why his routine felt different. Then he heard soft breathing from the living room and everything came rushing back. Elena. He lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how he felt about the previous night. Part of him wondered if he'd made a mistake. Getting involved in someone else's marriage problems was complicated territory, and David had never been good with complicated. But when he thought about Elena's face when she talked about her poetry, or the way she'd understood his photography without him having to explain it, the worry faded. Whatever was happening between them, it felt real in a way that scared him and excited him at the same time. David got dressed quietly and padded to the kitchen to make coffee. Through the doorway, he could see Elena curled up on his couch, still wearing his gray sweater. Her hair was messy from sleep, and she looked younger and more peaceful than she had the night before. The coffee machine was louder than he'd hoped, and Elena stirred as the smell filled the apartment. "Morning," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Morning. Coffee? Please." David poured 2 cups and brought one to Elena. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, and accepted the mug gratefully. "How did you sleep?" David asked, settling into the armchair across from her. "Better than I have in weeks, actually." Elena took a sip of coffee and made a small sound of appreciation. "You make good coffee. Thanks. It's one of my few domestic skills." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching sunlight stream through David's windows. The morning felt different from the intense emotional conversation of the night before, but no less intimate. There was something nice about sharing quiet space with another person. "I should probably go home soon," Elena said eventually. "Get changed. Figure out what I'm going to say to my husband." David nodded, though he felt a pang of disappointment. "What will you say?" "The truth, I think. At least part of it." Elena set down her mug and looked at David seriously. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not." "That sounds scary." "Terrifying," Elena agreed. "But maybe that's how I know it's the right thing to do." David understood that feeling. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding difficult conversations, and it had cost him his last relationship. Maybe Elena was braver than he was. "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "What happens to your perfectly ordered hermit life now that you've let a crazy neighbor disrupt it?" David laughed. "I don't think you're crazy. Impulsive, maybe, but not crazy. Impulsive is being generous." "I prefer impulsive to invisible," David said. "At least impulsive people feel things strongly enough to act on them." Elena smiled. "Is that your way of saying you're glad I barged into your apartment last night?" David thought about this seriously. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been a logo design deadline. Now he was sitting in his living room having the most honest conversation he'd had in months with a woman who'd somehow become important to him overnight. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am glad." Elena stood up and walked to David's window, looking out at the city coming to life below them. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Last night, when I did what I did, why didn't you take advantage of the situation?" "Most guys would have." David joined her at the window. "Because that's not what you really wanted." "How did you know that?" "Because you were crying. Because you looked lost, not seductive. Because taking advantage of someone when they're hurting isn't something I could live with." Elena turned to look at him. "Even if I had wanted it? Even if I hadn't been crying?" David met her gaze. "Even then. Not like that. Not when you're married to someone else and clearly going through something difficult. You're a good person, David." "I'm really not. I'm selfish and emotionally stunted and probably terrible relationship material. But I try not to be cruel." Elena laughed. "You're definitely not terrible relationship material." "How would you know?" "You've known me for 12 hours. Because in 12 hours you've listened to me more than my husband has in 12 months. You've seen my poetry and my middle-of-the-night emotional breakdown, And you still made me coffee this morning. David felt that warm feeling in his chest again. Elena, I know, she said quickly. I know this is complicated. I'm married, I'm a mess, and I have no idea what I'm doing with my life. I'm not asking for anything from you. What if I wanted to give you something anyway? Elena looked surprised. Like what? Like friendship. Like someone who thinks your poetry isn't terrible and wants to hear more of it. Like a person who sees you. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I'd like that. Good. Because I think I need that too. Elena walked back to the couch and started folding the blanket she'd used. I should go change clothes before I have the most important conversation of my marriage. Do you want me to walk you up? For moral support? No, but thank you. This is something I need to do alone. She paused. But maybe we could get coffee later. Like actual coffee at a real coffee shop like normal people? David grinned. I'd like that. There's a place downtown that has terrible poetry readings on Thursday nights. Very amateur, very honest. That sounds perfect. Elena walked to the door, then turned back. David, thank you. For last night, for this morning, for making me remember who I used to be. Thank you for trusting me with who you are now. After Elena left, David sat in his quiet apartment and realized something had shifted. The space didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt full of possibility. 3 months later, David was setting up his camera equipment for Elena's first public poetry reading. She'd left her husband after 2 months of couples therapy that had made it clear. They both wanted different things from life. It had been sad but not devastating, the kind of ending that felt like relief rather than tragedy. Elena was nervous, fidgeting with her notebook and asking David for the 3rd time if her poem about invisible people was too depressing for a coffee shop audience. It's perfect, David assured her. And even if it wasn't, it's yours. That makes it worth sharing. As Elena took the small stage, David thought about that night she'd pushed open his door. She'd been looking for someone to see her, and somehow they'd ended up seeing each other. Not the perfect versions of themselves they'd been trying to be for other people, but the messy, honest, complicated versions that were actually worth knowing. Elena began reading her poem, her voice stronger than she'd expected it to be. David took pictures, capturing the moment she stopped being invisible and started being seen. Later, they'd go back to his apartment and look at the photos together, and Elena would write a poem about how sometimes the best things in life begin with the worst decisions. But that was later. Right now, David just listened to Elena's voice filling the coffee shop with words about loneliness and connection, and the courage it takes to push open someone's door and ask to be seen. It was beautiful. It was honest. It was definitely not terrible poetry.